Old vines in no way guarantee good wine. And this is one of the most heartbreaking truths for lovers of old vine wines. Even more so for the tireless farmers who've gone to the trouble of trying to preserve a certified heritage vineyard. Because you can have a majestic old dame of a vineyard full of ancient bush vines twisted and gnarled like elegant though thoroughly arthritic knuckles. And while the beauty of this may be undeniable, you then taste the wine and find it to be comprehensively mid. This is exactly why Wine Mag launched their Old Vine Wine Report, which is an unsighted tasting, so all wines are tasted blind. The idea is to provide a list of wines that are not only produced from really beautiful certified heritage vineyards, but that also taste delicious in the glass. Now, today's hand drink solo curious wine of the day is exactly such a wine, and that is the Dutoitskloof Old Vine Sauvignon Blanc, produced with fruit from a single vineyard that was lovingly nicknamed Opa, due to the fact that it is super old, planted back in 1985 in the Dutoitskloof region. Now, this wine was one of 9 of the top highest scoring wines from the Wine Mag report for 2025. And interestingly, it was the only Sauvignon Blanc in that list. Now, it's not the oldest Sauvignon Blanc vineyard in the country. That honor goes to the Amos Block Sauvignon Blanc vineyard, which was planted in 1965 in the Swartland and is currently farmed by the Fairview team. And from that vineyard come 2 fascinating wines. One is a straight up still Sauvignon Blanc, and the other is a sort of perpetual reserve sherry style wine, which is 1000% worth tracking down. But today is not about Amos, it's about Opa. Opa as a vineyard is important because Sauvignon Blancs are generally not built to age. And at this point, you might say, Han, ye pra twak, oh maat. And this is because if you look at the Old Vine Project website, you'll see that Sauvignon Blanc is the 3rd most represented cultivar of all the old vine hectarage in the South African National Vineyard. And I'd say, well, not so fast. I may not be speaking as much twak as you think, because the first reason that explains that listing is the fact that Sauvignon Blanc has the 2nd most hectares of vineyards in the entire National Vineyard. And it's closing fast on first place, which is Chenin Blanc, even though Chenin is way more famous internationally with regards to its reputation. And yet Sauvignon Blanc is right up there. So that partially explains why there are so many hectares of old vines, over 35 years of age, that is, simply because there are so many hectares of Sauvignon Blanc across the country. But if we look a little closer and we look at a list of the 30 oldest vineyards in South Africa, we see that Sauvignon Blanc does not feature once. It's chock-a-block full of Semillon and Chenin Blanc and Muscat and Cinsault, but no Sauvignon Blanc. So why do Sauvignon Blanc vines generally not reach these grand old ages? First of all, is because they have an uncanny knack for picking up grapevine trunk diseases. Or eutypa is one example, or dead arm disease. And this involves getting an infection, a fungal infection, through a pruning wound, where a viticulturist may cut a cordon back, and this fungal infection gets in and essentially rots the vine from the inside out. The other reason that many vines don't make it is because, at least in South Africa, it's true to say that still a large majority of Sauvignon Blanc is planted with maximum yield to produce characterless bulk wine. And this is kind of like treating your Sauvignon Blanc vine like a plantation slave rather than a beloved citizen, which does no good for anyone's life expectancy. In fact, it kind of takes it all the way down to the realms of extreme sportsmen and mothers of 12. Dutoitskloof is not your average large faceless wine cooperative, although it is a large wine cooperative. It was founded as far back as 1962 from 6 growers initially. And today there are 22 farms that provide fruit for this co-op and 13 farmers. And almost all of the fruit that makes it into that cellar comes from a 10-kilometer radius, although there are some interesting projects from further afield that we'll touch on later. Another thing that sets Dutoitskloof apart from other co-ops is the fact that it has a really strong sense of continuity, in that many of the producers that provide fruit for today were amongst those founding families. And that sense of history really shapes the cellar's identity to this day. Dutoitskloof did start out with bulk wine roots. But back in the 90s, when South Africa re-entered the international arena, they very quickly moved towards bottling their own wines under their own labels and their own brand. This move not only earned them a reputation for innovation, but they were also one of the earliest fair trade accredited co-ops, which alongside innovation gave them a reputation for social upliftment and really looking to transform the society that had been crippled by its recent history. Another thing that fascinates me about Dutoitskloof is despite the fact that they do produce large amounts of really mainstream wines, there is a little sneaky sense of adventure in their portfolio, and not least of all expressed through the bottling of a Nebbiolo, which is the result of some really clever winemaking. But also they've got a Sauvignon Blanc and a Shiraz from Agulhas, which is a fascinating area and produces supremely distinct wines with very clear flavor profiles that speak of that region and proves that they're not just about staying close to home and playing it safe. So I guess what makes Dutoitskloof compelling for Hand Drink Solo is not that it's a tiny family estate, but rather that it has a family continuation ethos. It also has a sense of adventure with unusual cultivars, while also showing that it's willing to preserve certified heritage vineyards and experiment with new regions. But I guess none of that really matters unless the wine tastes good in the glass. So, when we give this guy a sniff, well, to be honest, the nose is a little quiet up front. And this is not unusual for old vine wines. In fact, often in blind tasting competitions, old vine wines will be put in a category all of their own because there's a fairly tired, although still quite useful analogy that young wines are like young people, loud, brash, full of opinions, whereas older vine wines are like older people. They talk less and they usually listen a little bit more, but when they do decide to speak, it's worth listening. So what does this one have to say? Well, there's a little combination of perhaps white flowers, a touch of elderflower, alongside something slightly wilder. It's not quite honeybush, but perhaps a kind of fynbos, dry wild flowers. But then, unsurprisingly, there is some citrus as well. Though it's not this fresh, kind of zesty citrus element. It's more like a lemon curd. Like there's a subtle hint of caramelization to that citrus rather than just being pure and fresh. And I guess part of this is because many components in this wine were barrel fermented. Some were fermented in tanks, others were fermented in barrel, and then they were blended before bottling. But that barrel fermentation is going to give you some of that caramelization hint that is almost like a layer over the fruit. So let's give it a sip. Well, the wine both tightens up and deepens very quickly on the palate. There's a huge amount of weight, which is not super common for Sauvignon Blancs, unless you are at the super premium end. You might say, but Han, is this weight and concentration from the old vines? And I'd say yes, but in this case, mostly no. There's a rather unconventional winemaking technique used here where the grapes are pressed and the juice is then frozen, it's kept at -4, and then kind of as it thaws, you're able to run off excess water, but preserve the actual juice in a far more concentrated form. In fact, the same thing happens when you freeze milk at home and then thaw it. And if you pour the milk out before it's fully thawed, you'll see that a rich, thick cream comes out first and ice remains back in the packet, which is super annoying for the person who comes later that day and has to drink what's left. Baristas at the international barista competitions used to do that with their milk in order to be able to deliver a far richer, creamier milk serving when producing their milk beverages in the flat white or cappuccino round of their performance. Pure concentration aside, what actual flavors are in there? Well, again, it really revolves around citrus, but what's lovely is that it's a whole number of different types of citrus. You have Meyer lemon pith, a kind of bitterness, which also has white grapefruit notes to it. So it's really dynamic. It's not just weight, but you feel these types of citrus teasing apart. And then softening that bitterness is something much more welcoming, kind of like a homemade lemonade sweetness that comes in and sets up against that bitterness. And it's the kind of homemade lemonade where you still have the pith floating in the juice and it's still murky. It's got that kind of texture to it. It's really quite engaging. And that texture is hugely important because the wine's not just concentrated because it's been reduced, but these flavors persist. There's length and they shift and they change. And so you start out with that bright, more the Meyer lemon and the grapefruit, And then that persists through a little bit of sweetness, the homemade lemonade. Some of that lemon curd from the aroma comes onto the palate, touch of that oaky influence. And then it morphs and shifts almost into a quite taut, tidy, lime cordial finish, which is not unlike an oaked Chardonnay. It's a supremely distinct expression of Sauvignon Blanc. So you could get hung up on the winemaking technique and call it manipulation, or you could judge the wine in the glass, which is absolutely stupendous. Now, while you pour yourself a second glass, I'm going to leave you links to 2 videos, one of which will tell you about Dutoitskloof's Nebbiolo, a fascinating wine in its own right, also using some unusual winemaking techniques. And the second is a video that dives into the Amos Block Vineyard, which I told you guys about earlier. So give those a gander, and until next time, stay curious and always drink niche.